So we started off in, with chapter 7 in the medium run, which had everything to do with labor and unemployment. So we looked at the causes of unemployment and the dynamics of unemployment in an economy, and so on and so forth. The important things to know from this chapter, one is the wage setting relation. The next is the price setting relation. So not just knowing these relations, but understanding how we arrive at them, how to analyze these relations, what causes these relations to change, and so on and so forth. You guys have to know all of that for the midterm. So what were these relationships? I don't think I remember. So the price setting relationship was effectively wage equals oh, price is equal to wage times 1 plus markup. And what was the wage setting relation? The wage setting relationship was expected price equals to wage equals to expected price times a function of unemployment. I think that was the wage setting relation. And what we did from here is, of course, notice that wages over here are just nominal wages, but you don't really care about your nominal wage, do you? What you care about is what you can buy with the money that you're earning. So if someday your boss doubles your salary, but at the same time the price of everything in the economy increases by 3 times, you can actually buy less things with how much money you're earning. So what you care about is the real wage. And so what we did is with these two relations, with the wage setting relation, we did this. We divided both sides with price. And with the price setting relation, same thing. We divided both sides with price. And we got this. So this. We put them together. This is what we found. And we drew the diagram of the wage setting relation. What we saw was this and this. So now this is the price setting relation. So it's called price setting relation. And this is the wage setting relation. And we had the equilibrium. So over here we have unemployment, and over here we have real wage, right? So a few takeaways from this chapter, things you should keep in mind. One thing is to understand the price setting relation and the wage setting relation. So first of all, how to derive them, what they tell us, the meaning of the relations, and what makes them change. So same thing we've seen in the previous chapter. What would have to happen for wage setting relation to come here? What would have to happen for price setting relation to come here? What are the factors that change these relations? That's something you guys need to understand clearly. That's the first thing. And second thing to notice, it's not a learning outcome, but notice that we have introduced price in our model. So in the short run analysis, there was no price. In this model, you see that we do have price. So price here in the weight setting relation and price here in the price setting relation. So we are moving forward. What was the next chapter? This was 7. So in chapter 8, we took a look at Phillips curve. The Phillips curve effectively was, if I'm not mistaken, pi t minus expectation of price was equal to u hat of this lambda times ut minus. I think this was it. I may be mistaken. But effectively, what we saw, if I were to explain it graphically, is that unemployment here, we have inflation here, and the relationship initially thought to be like this. So what economists used to think was that this is the traditional Phillips curve, where change in unemployment changes inflation in the economy. But what happened, this was fine until in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, and so on. But in the 1970s, this relationship broke down. And what emerged was that the relationship looked more like this. So what was happening, this doesn't matter. So instead of unemployment changing the inflation, the new relationship that emerged is that change in unemployment changes the change in inflation. And this is the modern Phillips curve. So we were introduced to this in chapter 8. So the things to remember from this chapter is to derive the Phillips curve and analysis Phillips curve when we have two scenarios. When expectation of inflation is a fixed number and when expectation of inflation is previous years. So these are the two things that you all should understand. And I've already actually talked about this, right? So we got started with medium run. We talked about unemployment in chapter 7. We talked about inflation or price level in chapter 8. Then we moved on to chapter 9, which was basically where we saw the ISLM PC model. So what we did was in chapter 3 and 4, 3, 4, and 5, we combined the goods market with the financial market to get the ISLM curve, the model. Then in chapter 7 and 8, we took a look at unemployment and inflation. In chapter 9, this gave us the Phillips curve. In chapter 9, we're going to combine these two and come up with the ISLM relationship. So just take a step back and look at how far we have got before I start talking about chapter 9. You've all done Eco 102, and in Eco 102, we've talked about all of this. We talked about inflation and unemployment and the goods market and financial market. You all know all of this already. But when we did all of this in Eco 102, these were separate chapters. We looked at all of this in isolation, and there was really no relationship between, let's say, inflation and the financial market. What we have done in 207 so far is we've taken them, each of them, and step by step, we've incorporated all of this into one model. And at least when I was doing this back in my university days, I was quite amazed that we were able to do this. Take all these disparate concepts that I thought only worked in isolation, and we were able to put them all together. It was really amazing, at least it was for me back then. So what did we do in chapter 9? We started off with the I7 curve. I7. We drew a Phillips curve. This is Y, this is I, and this is effectively change in inflation. And you know, change in inflation is basically inflation in this period minus expected inflation. So just take a look at what's happening. We have the goods market and the financial market here. We have inflation and unemployment here, or rather we've replaced unemployment with output. Same thing, and we've combined them. And so effectively, everything you've learned in Eco 102, all of that entire course of learning is represented in this one model or one framework. And if that does not amaze you, I don't know what will. Because it looks so simple, really. But we can have so much scope for analysis and understanding from this one simple thing. So, important things from this chapter. Understanding the difference between this down and this. This is very important because, all right, so think about it. If we are in this scenario where our expectation of inflation is formed around a fixed level, so suppose this is 3%, okay? Or actually, no, let me just draw the diagram that might explain this better. If we just have this, okay, this is the Phillips curve, and suppose we are at this point. So where we want to be is at this point, right? At this point, we have this is where we want to be. But what we have is a higher rate of inflation. This is obviously higher than this. So suppose we want 3% inflation, but what we have in the economy is 6% inflation. So how do we solve this? We've already talked about monetary policy and fiscal policy and how the government will uh, implement those policies. And suppose the government does that. The government implements either monetary or fiscal policy, or maybe both, and we come down. Okay, we come down to this point. We are at this equilibrium point where inflation is equal to this, which is 3%. And in this case, our job is done. We wanted 3% inflation, we have got 3% inflation. However, if instead of this, we have pi t minus pi t minus 1. Okay? And let's take a look at a similar scenario. So we are at this point. Over here, what is happening? Once again, pay attention here, or I mean, this is review, so hopefully you've paid attention to the original video. So what we have is, in this is more than 0. Over here we have 0. That means inflation this year is higher than inflation in the previous year. And that means this is increasing. So let me write down a few years: 2015, 2016, 2017, 2018. What's happening is inflation is increasing every year. So suppose we start off with 7%, then it goes up to 8%, then it goes up to 9%, and so on. Because of this, inflation continues to increase every single year. The change in inflation is positive. That's the main difference between this, what's happening, between this and this, is that the change in inflation is increasing. Now suppose the government once again implements monetary or fiscal policy and they're successful, and we are back to this point. Okay, at this point, change is 0, which means inflation this year is equal to inflation last year. So we have stabilized the change in inflation, but the job is not done. In this case, the job was done. Over here, the job is not done because we've only stabilized the change in inflation, but inflation has not gone down. So this was 10, this will be 10, this will be 10. So inflation is still high. It's not increasing anymore. But 10% inflation is still very high. So what the government will actually need to do in this case is implement a policy that takes us, let's say, to this point. At this point, what we are going to have is two things. First of all, inflation this year is less than inflation from the previous year. So what happens is this was 10. So suppose this year we will have 9%, then we will have 8%, and in 2021 we will have 7%, and inflation has started to fall. But what's the other thing that has happened? Suppose this is Y1 and this is Y2. What do we see? Y2 is less than Y1. So in order to not just stabilize the inflation, but bring inflation down, the government has had to create a recession. This had to happen. And see, after a while in 2022, it's down to 6%, and so on. This is going to go on until suppose we decide that 4% inflation is good enough. And once we get to that 4%, the government can implement a policy that takes us here. So the difference was that over here, we could move from A to B straight away and everything was fine. But in this instance, if we have A, B, and C, we cannot move from A to B because inflation continues to be high. So we have to move from A to C and then to B. Okay? And the reverse is also true. If we find ourselves in C, we can't jump directly to B. From C, we have to move to A, and then we have to come back to B. So that's the additional step that central banks have to take when we have a scenario where expectation of inflation is informed by previous year's inflation. Things are much easier when expectation of inflation is just formed around a fixed level. So that was it, what we've done for medium run. And I think I've covered everything. So hopefully this videos help you all preparing for the midterm. We have one more live session left, so make use of that as well if you want to. And good luck to all of you. The midterm and also quiz too, that's coming.